When that email notification from the county courthouse appeared on my phone, I never expected it would be the beginning of my greatest revenge story. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing quarterly reports for one of my investment properties, when my phone lit up with the message, "Divorce hearing confirmation, case 47291, Matthews versus Matthews." My husband of 12 years, Richard, had filed for divorce 2 months ago. I wasn't surprised when it happened. Our marriage had been dissolving for the past year, but I was blindsided by how he did it. No discussion, no attempt at counseling. Just papers delivered to me at our home by a courier while he was conveniently away on a business trip with his legal team. Richard was a partner at Caldwell & Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. He specialized in divorce cases, ironically enough, and had built his reputation by securing favorable outcomes for wealthy clients, typically men looking to protect their assets from their soon-to-be ex-wives. What Richard didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn during our 12 years together, was that before we met, I had quietly built my own empire. While he saw me as nothing more than the supportive wife who organized dinner parties for his colleagues and clients, I was actually a silent investor in numerous businesses across the city. I kept this separate from our marriage, maintaining my maiden name for all business dealings. 3 years into our marriage, an opportunity came up that I couldn't resist. Through a complex network of shell companies and investment groups, I had secretly become the majority owner of the very law firm where Richard worked. I never intended to use this information. I loved Richard, despite his workaholic tendencies and emotional distance. I thought we had a good life together, and I was content to keep my business dealings separate. But then came Ashley, his 26-year-old paralegal. I discovered their affair 8 months ago when I stopped by his office unexpectedly, with lunch. The way they looked at each other, the subtle touches, I'd been married to him long enough to know. I said nothing, deciding to watch and wait. Within weeks, he was working late more frequently, taking weekend conferences, and growing increasingly distant. I hired a private investigator who confirmed my suspicions with photographs of them together at a resort 3 hours away. Still, I waited, giving Richard the opportunity to come clean, to talk to me, to try to work through whatever was happening. Instead, I received divorce papers on a Tuesday morning while he was in Chicago with Ashley. The papers were brutal, claiming irreconcilable differences while simultaneously accusing me of emotional abandonment of the marriage. He was seeking an uneven split of our assets, claiming his career and connections had been the primary source of our wealth. I called Diane, my best friend since college, and the only person who knew the full extent of my business holdings. "He's trying to screw you over," she said bluntly after I explained the situation. "I know," I replied, a strange calm settling over me. "But he has no idea who he's up against." "Are you going to tell him about the firm?" Diane asked. "Not yet," I said, formulating my plan. "I think I'll wait for the perfect moment." I hired my own attorney, not from Richard's firm, obviously, and proceeded to respond to the divorce petition as any wronged wife would. I appeared appropriately upset in our preliminary hearings, dressed modestly, and spoke softly. Richard seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't falling apart, but he maintained his professional demeanor, only occasionally whispering to his attorney. For 2 months, we proceeded through the standard divorce process: discovery, financial disclosures, negotiations. I was careful to only disclose what was legally required: my personal accounts, our joint holdings, the house. My business interests, hidden behind layers of corporations, never came up. Then came the email confirming our court date, the official hearing where everything would be decided. I scrolled further down the message, and my heart skipped a beat when I read the final line. "All parties must be present at the hearing. No exceptions or representatives permitted." A slow smile spread across my face. Richard wouldn't be able to hide behind his legal team. He would have to face me directly. And if my sources were correct, he was planning to bring Ashley to the courthouse. Not into the actual hearing, but to wait outside, a show of solidarity, and perhaps a glimpse of his future. Little did he know, I had been preparing for this day since those divorce papers arrived, and I had a surprise of my own waiting for him. The morning of the hearing arrived with unusual clarity. I woke before my alarm, feeling strangely calm despite what was at stake. I chose my outfit carefully, a tailored navy suit that projected confidence without appearing showy, pearl earrings Richard had given me for our 5th anniversary, and my grandmother's vintage Cartier watch. The watch was my good luck charm, a reminder that I came from a line of strong women who had faced their own battles. I arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early, not wanting to risk running into Richard and Ashley before the proceedings began. My attorney, Meredith Sloan, met me at a coffee shop across the street. She was brilliant, sharp, and completely unintimidated by Richard's reputation. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, sliding into the booth opposite me. "More than ready," I replied, taking a sip of my espresso. "Is everything in place?" She nodded, patting her leather portfolio. "All the documents are here. We've got the ownership records, the financial statements, and the transfer authorizations. The moment he tries to claim that his career was the backbone of your financial stability, we drop the bomb," I finished. "It's going to be quite the spectacle," Meredith said with a slight smile. "Are you sure you want to do it this way? We could always present this information during settlement negotiations. Less dramatic, but potentially less messy." I shook my head. Richard thrives on control and appearance. He needs to understand exactly what he's losing and who he's been underestimating all these years. As we walked across the street to the courthouse, I spotted them immediately, Richard and Ashley, arriving together in his sleek black Audi. She stepped out first, all long legs and bouncy blonde hair, wearing a dress that belonged more at a cocktail party than a courthouse. Richard followed, adjusting his tie as he got out of the car. He looked confident, almost smug. I ducked behind a pillar, not wanting them to see me yet. Meredith raised an eyebrow but followed my lead. "That's them?" she whispered, peering around me. "Yes," I confirmed, watching as Richard placed his hand on the small of Ashley's back, guiding her up the courthouse steps. "She's 26, a paralegal at the firm. Started working for him about a year ago." "Classic," Meredith muttered. We waited until they entered the building before following. Inside, the courthouse bustled with activity, attorneys hurrying between courtrooms, clients nervously waiting on benches, security guards directing traffic. I spotted Richard and Ashley near the directory, his head bent close to hers as he said something that made her laugh. Then he noticed me. His expression shifted instantly, the smile vanishing as he straightened up. I maintained eye contact, keeping my face neutral as I approached. "Richard," I said coolly, stopping a few feet away from them. "Elizabeth," he replied with a slight nod. His eyes flickered to Meredith. "I see you've brought counsel." "Just as you have," I said, noting the absence of his usual attorney. Instead, he was accompanied by Marcus Weber, the senior partner at Caldwell & Associates. Interesting choice, sending the big gun to handle what should have been a straightforward divorce. Richard cleared his throat. "This is Ashley," he said, gesturing to the young woman beside him. "She's here for support." I raised an eyebrow. "How thoughtful of you to bring your girlfriend to our divorce hearing." Ashley had the decency to look uncomfortable, her cheeks flushing slightly. Richard's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Marcus stepped forward. "Mrs. Matthews, perhaps we could speak privately before the hearing begins?" he suggested, his voice smooth and practiced. "I believe there's still an opportunity to resolve this matter amicably." "I'm sure there is," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I think we'll let the judge hear what we both have to say first." Marcus's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. As you wish. As we moved toward the courtroom, I caught Richard whispering something to Ashley, who nodded and took a seat on a bench outside. She would wait there during the proceedings, the loyal girlfriend ready to comfort him afterward. The thought almost made me laugh. Inside courtroom C, Richard and Marcus took their places at one table while Meredith and I settled at another. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and penetrating eyes, entered shortly after. All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Harwood, the bailiff announced. As we stood, I stole a glance at Richard. He appeared calm, confident, a man who believed he had the upper hand. In a few minutes, that confidence would crumble. The judge began by reviewing the basic facts of our case: 12 years of marriage, no children, substantial assets to be divided. She looked between us, her expression giving nothing away. I understand. There are some disputes regarding the division of assets, she said, looking at the preliminary filings. Mr. Matthews claims that his career has been the primary source of the couple's wealth and is seeking 70% of the joint assets. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus responded, standing. Mr. Matthews has been a partner at Caldwell and Associates for the past 8 years. His income and connections have been the foundation of their financial standing. Judge Harwood looked at me. And Mrs. Matthews, you dispute this characterization? This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for. I nodded to Meredith, who stood, with a document in hand. Yes, Your Honor, Meredith said confidently. We not only dispute it, but we have evidence that will significantly alter the court's understanding of this case. Richard shifted in his seat, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face for the first time. Our marriage had been dissolving for the past year, but I was blindsided by how he did it. No discussion, no attempt at counseling, just papers delivered. To me at our home by a courier, while he was conveniently away on a business trip with his legal team. Richard was a partner at Caldwell and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. He specialized in divorce cases, ironically enough, and had built his reputation by securing favorable outcomes for wealthy clients, typically men looking to protect their assets from their soon-to-be ex-wives. What Richard didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn during our 12 years together, was that before we met, I had quietly built my own empire. While he saw me as nothing more than the supportive wife who organized dinner parties for his colleagues and clients, I was actually a silent investor in numerous businesses across the city. I kept this separate from our marriage, maintaining my maiden name for all business dealings. 3 years into our marriage, an opportunity came up that I couldn't resist. Through a complex network of shell companies and investment groups, I had secretly become the majority owner of the very law firm where Richard worked. I never intended to use this information. I loved Richard, despite his workaholic tendencies and emotional distance. I thought we had a good life together, and I was content to keep my business dealings separate. But then came Ashley, his 26-year-old paralegal. I discovered their affair 8 months ago when I stopped by his office unexpectedly. With lunch, the way they looked at each other, the subtle touches. I'd been married to him long enough to know. I said nothing, deciding to watch and wait. Within weeks, he was working late more frequently, taking weekend conferences, and growing increasingly distant. I hired a private investigator who confirmed my suspicions with photographs of them together at a resort 3 hours away. Still, I waited, giving Richard the opportunity to come clean, to talk to me, to try to work through whatever was happening. Instead, I received divorce papers on a Tuesday morning while he was in Chicago with Ashley. The papers were brutal, claiming irreconcilable differences while simultaneously accusing me of emotional abandonment of the marriage. He was seeking an uneven split of our assets, claiming his career and connections had been the primary source of our wealth. I called Diane, my best friend since college and the only person who knew the full extent of my business holdings. "He's trying to screw you over," she said bluntly after I explained the situation. "I know," I replied, a strange calm settling over me. "But he has no idea who he's up against." "Are you going to tell him about the firm?" Diane asked. "Not yet," I said, formulating my plan. "I think I'll wait for the perfect moment." I hired my own attorney, not from Richard's firm, obviously, and proceeded to respond to the divorce petition as any wronged wife would. I appeared appropriately upset in our preliminary hearings, dressed modestly, and spoke softly. Richard seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't falling apart, but he maintained his professional demeanor, only occasionally whispering to his attorney. For 2 months, we proceeded through the standard divorce process: discovery, financial disclosures, negotiations. I was careful to only disclose what was legally required: my personal accounts, our joint holdings, the house. My business interests, hidden behind layers of corporations, never came up. Then came the email confirming our court date, the official hearing where everything would be decided. I scrolled further down the message, and my heart skipped a beat when I read the final line. "All parties must be present at the hearing. No exceptions or representatives permitted." A slow smile spread across my face. Richard wouldn't be able to hide behind his legal team. He would have to face me directly. And if my sources were correct, he was planning to bring Ashley to the courthouse, not into the actual hearing, but to wait outside, a show of solidarity and perhaps a glimpse of his future. Little did he know, I had been preparing for this day since those divorce papers arrived, and I had a surprise of my own waiting for him. "Your Honor," Meredith began, "we would like to submit evidence regarding Mrs. Matthews's financial holdings, which have been independently maintained throughout the marriage." Judge Harwood nodded, and the bailiff collected the documents from Meredith to distribute to the judge and opposing counsel. I watched Richard's face carefully as Marcus received the paperwork. At first, he appeared merely curious, then confused as he began scanning the pages. "As you can see," Meredith continued, "Mrs. Matthews has maintained substantial business interests under her maiden name, Elizabeth Winters, throughout the duration of the marriage. These interests include multiple real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and, most notably, majority ownership of Winters Holdings LLC, which acquired controlling interest in Caldwell & Associates law firm 9 years ago." The courtroom fell silent. Marcus froze, his finger hovering over the page he'd been reading. Slowly, he turned to look at Richard, whose expression had transformed from confusion to disbelief. "That's impossible," Richard said, his voice cracking. "Slightly." He looked at me, then back at the documents. "This must be some kind of mistake." "There's no mistake, Mr. Matthews," Meredith replied calmly. "The documentation is quite clear. Through a series of investment vehicles and holding companies, Mrs. Matthews has owned 62% of Caldwell & Associates for the past 9 years. She has been essentially your employer throughout your partnership at the firm." Richard's face drained of color. "Elizabeth?" he said, looking at me directly for what felt like the first time in years. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Is this true?" I met his gaze steadily. "Yes, Richard, it's true." Judge Harwood cleared her throat, clearly recognizing the significance of this revelation. "Mr. Weber, were you aware of this arrangement?" Marcus, who had been flipping frantically through the documents, looked up with a carefully composed expression. "No, Your Honor. This information was not disclosed to the partnership." "It was disclosed to the board of directors of the parent company," Meredith countered smoothly. "As legally required, the structure of ownership was never hidden. It simply wasn't advertised to the daily operations team." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This changes everything," he said, turning to Marcus. "We need to regroup." "Sit down, Mr. Matthews," Judge Harwood ordered firmly. "We're in the middle of proceedings." Richard reluctantly returned to his seat, but I could see the panic setting in. Everything he thought he knew about me, about his position, about this divorce, had just been upended. Your Honor, Meredith continued, in light of this information, we believe Mr. Matthews's claim that his career was the primary contributor to the couple's wealth is demonstrably false. In fact, Mrs. Matthews' business acumen and investments have far outpaced his earnings during their marriage. Judge Harwood studied the documents carefully. These are significant revelations, Mrs. Matthews. Why weren't these assets disclosed in the initial financial declarations? They were disclosed in my personal financial statement, Your Honor, I replied. The business holdings are listed under separate documentation as required by law. My counsel can provide the complete filing trail if needed. The judge nodded, then looked at Richard and Marcus. Counsel, do you need time to review these documents and adjust your position? Marcus cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Given this new information, we would request a brief recess to confer with our client. Granted, Judge Harwood said. We'll take 30 minutes. When we reconvene, I expect both parties to be prepared to discuss a more realistic division of assets. As the judge exited the courtroom, Richard remained frozen in his seat, staring at the documents in front of him. Marcus leaned over, speaking urgently in his ear, but Richard seemed unable to process what was happening. I stood and smoothed my skirt, feeling unexpectedly calm. This moment, watching the realization dawn on him that I wasn't who he thought I was both vindicating and sad. 12 years of marriage, and he had never really known me. As Meredith and I prepared to leave the courtroom for the recess, Richard finally snapped out of his daze and approached me. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded, his voice low and intense. All these years. Would it have mattered? I asked quietly. Would you have treated me differently if you'd known I wasn't just your wife, but also your boss? Of course it would. Have mattered. This is humiliating, I supplied. To discover your wife isn't just the supportive background character you assumed she was? His face flushed. That's not fair, Elizabeth. Neither was bringing your girlfriend to our divorce hearing, Richard, I replied coolly. Or trying to take 70% of our assets based on your inflated sense of importance. Marcus appeared at Richard's side, placing a warning hand on his arm. Richard, not here, he muttered. I stepped closer to Richard, lowering my voice so only he could hear. By the way, Ashley is still waiting outside. Someone should probably tell her that her boyfriend just discovered he's been sleeping with the boss's wife. The color drained from Richard's face again. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the courtroom, Marcus hurrying after him. Meredith raised an eyebrow as she watched them go. Well, that went about as expected. Yes, I agreed, gathering my purse, but we're not done yet. As we stepped into the hallway, I saw Richard speaking intensely with Ashley, whose expression cycled rapidly from confusion to shock to embarrassment. She glanced up, caught me watching, and quickly looked away. What happens now? Meredith asked, as we moved toward a private consultation room. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 12 years lifting from my shoulders. Now we negotiate, but this time, we do it on my terms. Meredith and I settled into the consultation room, closing the door on the courthouse chaos. Through the small window, I could see Richard and Ashley having what appeared to be an intense conversation. She was gesturing wildly, her face flushed with emotion, while Richard kept glancing nervously back toward the courtroom. He's in full damage control mode, Meredith observed, following my gaze. Both professionally and personally. I nodded, turning away from the window. Marcus is probably explaining to him right now what this means for his career. Dating the boss's wife isn't exactly a pathway to making senior partner. Speaking of which, Meredith said, taking a seat at the small table, we need to discuss your next move regarding the firm. Your ownership gives you significant leverage, not just in the divorce proceedings, but in Richard's professional future. I sat across from her, considering my options. In the heat of discovery and planning my courtroom revelation, I hadn't fully thought through the aftermath. What did I want from Caldwell and Associates now? What did I want from Richard? I never intended to interfere with the firm's operations, I admitted. My investment was purely financial. The partners run the day-to-day business and they've done well. Profits have increased every year. And yet you now have a personal conflict with one of those partners, Meredith pointed out. A partner who was presumably unaware his wife was essentially his employer throughout his career there. I smiled wryly. Richard always said I wasn't interested enough in his work. If only he'd known. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Diane. How's it going? Did you drop the bomb yet? I quickly typed back. Yes, currently in recess. His face was priceless. You realize, Meredith continued, that Richard is likely going to try to claim he built your wealth together, that his work at the firm directly benefited your investment. Let him try, I replied, setting down my phone. I purchased the controlling interest before he made partner. My initial capital came entirely from my family trust and my own investments. And I've kept meticulous records of every transaction. Meredith nodded approvingly. Good, because he's going to be desperate now. Men like Richard don't handle public humiliation well. A knock on the door interrupted us. It was Marcus, alone, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. May I speak with you, Elizabeth? He asked, his voice carefully measured. Privately. I glanced at Meredith, who nodded slightly. I'll be right outside, she said, gathering her notes and slipping past Marcus into the hallway. Once the door closed, Marcus sank into the chair Meredith had vacated, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. In all my decades practicing law, he began, I have never been blindsided like this. I imagine not, I replied calmly. Though, to be fair, the information was available to the board. It's not my fault no one connected Elizabeth Winters with Elizabeth Matthews. He looked at me, a mixture of annoyance and reluctant respect in his eyes. Why keep it secret from Richard? All these years. What was the point? I considered the question carefully. It wasn't the first time I'd asked myself the same thing. When I first made the investment, Richard and I had only been married for 3 years. He was an associate with ambitions, and I didn't want my financial position to overshadow his career. I thought it would hurt him, make him feel inadequate. I paused, memories of our early years washing over me. As time passed, it just became easier to keep that separation. Richard was building his reputation, and I didn't want anyone thinking he'd advanced because of my influence. And now? Marcus asked, leaning forward. What do you intend to do with your controlling interest now that this is all in the open? That depends largely on Richard, I replied honestly. And on you, Marcus. His eyebrows rose. Me? You're the managing partner. You set the tone for the firm. How you handle this situation and Richard will influence my decisions moving forward. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the implications. Richard is understandably distressed. He's requesting a settlement conference rather than continuing the hearing today. Is he now? I couldn't help the slight smile that tugged at my lips. And what terms is he proposing? A 50-50 split of all marital assets, Marcus said. And he's dropping all claims to your business holdings. How generous of him to offer me half of what's already mine, I remarked dryly. Marcus sighed. Elizabeth, Richard made a mistake. Several mistakes, actually. But he's been a valuable asset to the firm. Whatever personal issues exist between you two, I'm asking you to consider the broader implications before you make any decisions. I studied Marcus's face. He was worried, not just about Richard, but about himself, about all the partners who had no idea their fates had been in my hands for nearly a decade. I have no intention of dismantling the firm, Marcus, I assured him. As I said, my investment was always meant to be passive, The fact that Richard and I are divorcing doesn't change that. Relief flickered across his features, but I held up a hand before he could respond. However, I continued, I do expect the firm to handle this divorce ethically. No hidden assets, no legal games, no attempts to draw this out unnecessarily. A clean, fair split based on full financial disclosure from both sides. Marcus nodded quickly. Of course. Absolutely. And one more thing, I added, my voice hardening slightly. Richard's relationship with Ashley is a potential liability for the firm. I trust you'll address that appropriately. Understanding passed. Between us. Marcus stood, straightening his tie. I'll speak with Richard about the settlement proposal. We still have a few minutes before the recess ends. As he reached for the door, I called after him. Oh, and Marcus, when you're done, please, send Ashley in. I'd like a word with her as well. Ashley entered the consultation room like a student called to the principal's office, hesitant, nervous, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Her eyes darted around, avoiding direct contact with mine. Mrs. Matthews, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus said you wanted to see me. Please, sit down, I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. And call me Elizabeth. After all, you've been sleeping with my husband for at least 8 months. I think we're past formalities. She flinched, finally meeting my gaze. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, I assured her, keeping my tone neutral. I didn't ask to speak with you for an apology. I wanted to clarify a few things, for your sake as much as mine. Ashley sat down slowly, perching on the edge of the chair as if ready to flee at any moment. Up close, I could see she was younger than I'd initially thought, perhaps closer to 24 than 26. Her blonde hair was expensively highlighted, her makeup carefully applied to create a natural look that probably took 40 minutes to achieve. She was beautiful, in that fresh, unlined way that made women my age simultaneously envious and pitying. First, I began. I want to make it clear that I don't blame you for the end of my marriage. Richard and I had problems long before you came into the picture. Relief flooded her features, quickly followed by suspicion. She'd clearly been expecting recriminations, not absolution. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because I don't want you operating under any illusions about your situation, I replied calmly. Richard didn't leave me for you because of some grand passion or once-in-a-lifetime connection. He left because our marriage had become inconvenient, and you were convenient. Her cheeks flushed. You don't know anything about our relationship. I know Richard, I countered. I've known him for 14 years. Married to him for 12, and I know his pattern. When things get difficult or boring, he finds something or someone new and exciting to distract him. I leaned forward slightly. Did he tell you I was cold, distant, that I didn't understand his ambition or support his career? The flicker in her eyes told me I'd hit the mark. That's what he told his girlfriend before me, I continued. The one he was seeing when we met. He was engaged to her, actually. Did he mention that? Ashley's eyes widened slightly. He said his previous engagement ended mutually. I couldn't help but laugh. Is that what he called it? I suppose finding your fiancé in bed with another woman could be considered a mutual decision to end things. I swallowed hard. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know who you're really with, I said simply. And because your position at the firm is now complicated. Because you own it, she stated, a hint of defiance returning to her voice. Yes, though that's not the main issue. Office relationships happen. But you're a paralegal who's been sleeping with a partner, a married partner, who directly supervises your work. That creates liability issues for the firm. Fear flashed across her face. Are you firing me? I don't manage hiring and firing, I clarified. But the partners will need to address the situation, especially now that it's out in the open. At minimum, you'll need to be transferred to a different department, away from Richard's supervision. Ashley's posture stiffened. Richard promised we'd continue working together. He said we make a great team. I'm sure he did, I replied, unsurprised. Richard makes a lot of promises when they serve his immediate needs. Whether he keeps them is another matter entirely. I could see the doubt creeping into her expression, the first cracks in her certainty about the man she thought she knew. There's something else you should consider, I continued carefully. Richard built his reputation on high-profile divorce cases, securing favorable outcomes for wealthy men against their wives. Now he's on the receiving end of a divorce where his wife holds significant power over his career. The irony won't be lost on his colleagues or clients. Ashley bit her lip considering this. You're saying his reputation will be damaged. I'm saying his entire professional identity is built around being the smartest person in the room. The one who's always 3 steps ahead, I clarified. Today, that identity took a major hit. How he responds to that will tell you everything. You need to know about his character. Why do you care what happens to me? She asked suddenly. You should hate me. I sighed, feeling suddenly tired. Hate requires energy I'd rather direct elsewhere. And despite what you might think, I don't want to destroy Richard. I just want him to face the consequences of his choices, professionally and personally. For a long moment, Ashley said nothing, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. When she finally looked up, there was a new awareness in her expression. I didn't know, she said quietly. About the firm, about his previous engagement, about any of it. He made it sound like you were this cold, career-obsessed woman who neglected him. I smiled wryly. The irony being that he never actually knew what my career was. A soft knock on the door interrupted us. It was the bailiff, informing us that court would reconvene in 5 minutes. As Ashley stood to leave, she hesitated. What should I do now? That's not for me to decide, I replied. Honestly, but if I were you, I'd pay very close attention to how Richard treats you today, now that the power dynamic has shifted. People reveal their true character in moments of crisis. As the door closed behind her, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what was to come. The hardest part wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally in control of my own story. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically when we reconvened. Richard sat stiffly at his table, his earlier confidence replaced by a tightly controlled tension. Marcus sat beside him, papers neatly arranged, his professional demeanor firmly back in place. I noticed Ashley was nowhere to be seen. All rise, the bailiff announced as Judge Harwood re-entered the courtroom. After we were seated, the judge looked between our 2 tables, her expression revealing nothing. I understand the parties have had an opportunity to discuss new information. Where do we stand? Marcus stood. Your Honor, in light of the financial disclosures provided by Mrs. Matthews, we would like to propose a settlement agreement rather than proceeding with the contested hearing. Judge Harwood raised an eyebrow. That's a significant change in position, Counselor. Yes, Your Honor, Marcus acknowledged. After reviewing Mrs. Matthews's documentation, we recognize that Mr. Matthews's initial position regarding asset division was misguided. Richard's jaw clenched visibly at the characterization. I see, the judge said, turning to our side. Ms. Sloan, what is your client's position on settlement discussions? Meredith rose. Mrs. Matthews is open to reasonable settlement terms, Your Honor, provided they acknowledge the full extent of her separate property and fairly divide the actual marital assets. Judge Harwood nodded. Very well. Would the parties prefer to continue settlement discussions privately, or would you like the court to remain involved at this stage? Marcus and Meredith exchanged glances. Given the complexity of the assets involved, Meredith responded, We believe the court's continued oversight would be beneficial, at least until preliminary terms are established. I agree, Marcus added quickly, surprising me. I suspected he wanted the judge present as a buffer against any further revelations I might have planned. Proceed then, Judge Harwood directed. Mr. Weber, please outline your client's proposed terms. Marcus cleared his throat. Mr. Matthews is prepared to acknowledge that Mrs. Matthews's business holdings, including her ownership interest in Caldwell and Associates, constitute separate property not subject to division in the divorce. Further, he is willing to accept an equal division of the marital assets accumulated during their 12-year marriage. Judge Harwood looked at Richard, who nodded stiffly, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Additionally, Marcus continued, Mr. Matthews withdraws his previous claims regarding his career being the primary source of the couple's wealth and acknowledges Mrs. Matthews's significant financial contributions to the marriage. The judge made notes, then turned to our table. Ms. Sloan, your response? Meredith stood. Mrs. Matthews accepts the acknowledgement of her separate property and the equal division of marital assets. However, there are several specific items we wish to address. She proceeded to outline our position on the house. I wanted to sell it and split the proceeds. Richard's retirement accounts, subject to division as marital property, and various personal items with sentimental value. Throughout this exchange, Richard remained silent. His earlier bluster completely evaporated. Occasionally, his eyes would flick toward me, a mixture of anger and something else, perhaps regret, visible in his expression before he quickly looked away. As Meredith concluded our position, Judge Harwood nodded. These terms seem reasonable and fairly aligned. I believe we can reach a settlement agreement today. She turned to Richard. Mr. Matthews, you've been uncharacteristically quiet. Do you have anything to add before we proceed with formalizing these terms? For a moment, I thought Richard might maintain his silence. Then, slowly, he stood, straightening his shoulders. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his posture. I accept the terms as outlined. I would, however, like to address one additional matter. Judge Harwood nodded. Go ahead. Richard turned slightly, finally meeting my gaze directly. I would like to formally apologize to Mrs. Matthews for my conduct during the latter part of our marriage and for the adversarial approach I initially took to these proceedings. I blinked, genuinely surprised. This was not what I had expected. My behavior was unprofessional and disrespectful, he continued. Elizabeth deserved better, both as my wife and as a business associate. The slight hesitation before business associate spoke volumes about how difficult it was for him to acknowledge my ownership role in the firm. While I understand this apology doesn't change the outcome of our divorce, Richard added, I want the record to reflect my recognition of my own misconduct. Judge Harwood nodded, seemingly impressed by this unexpected display of accountability. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Your apology is noted. She turned to me. Mrs. Matthews, would you like to respond? All eyes in the courtroom turned to me. I stood slowly, taking a moment to collect my thoughts. Richard's apology had caught me off guard, not because I didn't think him capable of apologizing, but because it seemed genuinely unscripted. Marcus looked as surprised as I felt. I appreciate the apology, Your Honor, I said finally, and I accept it in the spirit in which it was offered. I paused, considering my next words carefully. What I said now would set the tone for whatever relationship, professional or otherwise, Richard and I might have moving forward. I would also like to clarify that my ownership stake in Caldwell and Associates was never intended to interfere with its operations or the careers of its partners, including Richard. That separation was important to me, and it remains so. The firm has been well managed under its current leadership, and I have no desire to change that arrangement. Relief visibly washed over Marcus's face. Richard's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the slight relaxation in his shoulders. With that understanding, I continued, I believe we can proceed amicably with finalizing our divorce and maintain appropriate professional boundaries thereafter. Judge Harwood nodded approvingly. Well said, Mrs. Matthews. She looked between. It seems we have the foundation for a settlement agreement. I'm going to direct both parties to work with my clerk to draft the formal documentation while I attend to another matter. We'll reconvene in 1 hour to review and finalize the agreement. She stood. Court is in recess. As the judge exited, Richard approached our table, leaving Marcus behind. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped in front of him. Elizabeth, he said quietly, could we speak privately for a moment? I glanced at Meredith, who nodded slightly. 5 minutes, I agreed, rising from my seat. No more. Richard and I found a quiet corner in the courthouse hallway, away from the flow of people. He looked different somehow. The polished, confident attorney replaced by someone more hesitant, more human. Where's Ashley? I asked, noticing she was no longer waiting on the bench outside the courtroom. A flash of discomfort crossed his face. She left. We decided it would be best. I raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. Whatever had transpired between them during our recess was their business now. Your apology in there, I said instead. Was that Marcus's idea? Richard's lips tightened slightly. No. Believe it or not, I'm capable of recognizing when I've been an ass. 12 years of marriage suggests otherwise, I replied, but there was no real heat in my words. He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. A rare gesture. Of frustration he typically avoided in professional settings. I deserved that. For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight of our shared history suspended between us. 12 years of marriage, vacations in Santorini and Paris, the miscarriage, in our 4th year that we never really talked about afterward, the gradual drift into separate lives under the same roof. How had we gone from finishing each other's sentences to becoming strangers? Why didn't you tell me? Richard finally asked, his voice quieter now. About the firm, about your other businesses, all of it. It was the question I'd been expecting since the moment my ownership was revealed. I'd prepared answers, rehearsed explanations, but standing here now, I found myself searching for the truth beneath the practiced responses. At first, it was because I didn't want to overshadow you, I admitted. You were so proud of making associate, so driven to become partner. I thought if you knew your wife essentially owned the firm, it would diminish your accomplishments somehow. Richard's expression softened slightly. And later? Later. I hesitated. Later, it just became the status quo. The longer I waited to tell you, the harder it became to bring it up. And honestly, after a while, I started to wonder if you'd even care. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? Richard, when was the last time you asked me about my day? About my interests? About anything in my life that didn't directly impact yours? I shook my head. You stopped seeing me years ago. I became background noise in your life. The wife who managed the house, hosted your business dinners, and never complained about your late nights at the office. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. A flicker of recognition in his eyes. I didn't know how to tell you that the quiet, supportive wife you took for granted was actually a successful businesswoman in her own right, I continued, not without it sounding like an accusation. Richard leaned against the wall, looking suddenly tired. I really believed you were happy with our arrangement, that you preferred being taken care of. That's because it was easier for you to believe that than to actually ask me what I wanted, I pointed out. Just like it was easier to start something with Ashley than to address the problems in our marriage. He winced at the mention of her name. That was a mistake. The affair or bringing her to our divorce hearing? I asked dryly. Both, he admitted, though the latter was particularly stupid. I was trying to make a point, I think. Show you I'd moved on, that I didn't need you anymore. How's that working out for you? I couldn't resist asking. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. About as well as you'd expect, given the circumstances. He straightened, his expression turning serious again. For what it's worth, Elizabeth, I am sorry. Not just about Ashley, but about all of it. Taking you for granted. Not seeing who you really were. The apology caught me off guard. In all our years together, Richard had rarely admitted fault so directly. Part of me wanted to savor this moment, the great Richard Matthews humbled and contrite. But another part recognized it for what it was, the beginning of closure. I appreciate that, I said simply. He hesitated, then asked, What happens now? With the firm, I mean. My position there. And there it was. The question that had likely been foremost in his mind since the revelation in the courtroom. For all his apparent contrition, Richard was still Richard. His career would always be his primary concern. That depends on you, I replied honestly. My ownership stake in Caldwell and Associates has always been an investment, not an operational role. I have no interest in interfering with the day-to-day management of the firm. Relief visibly washed over him. So my position is secure? Your position depends on your value to the firm, I clarified, which is substantial from what I understand. Marcus thinks highly of your legal abilities, if not your personal judgment. Richard nodded slowly. And will Marcus remain managing partner? As I said in court, I have no plans to change the leadership structure, I assured him. Unless, of course, something happens to make that necessary. He understood the implicit warning. And what about us? After today? I considered this carefully. What did I want our relationship to be once the divorce was finalized? Professionally, we maintain appropriate boundaries, I said finally. You continue your work at the firm. I continue my role as a passive investor. We interact only when absolutely necessary. And personally? Personally, Richard, we're done, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Not because of Ashley, but because we stopped being partners years ago. We stopped seeing each other, really seeing each other, and no amount of apologies or revelations can change that. He nodded, accepting this truth with surprising grace. For what it's worth, I did love you, Elizabeth. In my way. I know, I replied. I loved you too. But love isn't enough without respect and understanding. A courthouse clerk approached, informing us that Meredith and Marcus were waiting to begin drafting the settlement agreement. As we turned to walk back to the courtroom, Richard asked one last question. Did you plan this all along? To reveal your ownership during the divorce proceedings? I smiled slightly. No. Initially, I planned to let you have your divorce on your terms. Keep things simple and walk away. What changed? You made it personal, I replied. The accusations in your filing, bringing Ashley to the courthouse, trying to claim 70% of our assets based on your supposed superior contribution. I shrugged. You forced my hand. Richard shook his head, a rueful expression crossing his face. I should have known better than to underestimate you. Yes, I agreed as we reached the courtroom doors. You should have. For the first time that day, Richard laughed, a short, genuine sound of self-deprecation. Well played, Elizabeth. Well played. As we rejoined our attorneys, I felt a curious sense of freedom. This wasn't the ending I had imagined for our marriage, when we exchanged vows 12 years ago, but perhaps it was the ending we both needed. One that finally acknowledged the truth of who we were, both together and apart. And apart. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of legal negotiations and paperwork. Meredith and Marcus worked efficiently together, drafting language that protected both our interests while fairly dividing our actual marital assets. Richard and I sat at opposite ends of the conference room, speaking only when necessary to clarify details about specific properties or accounts. By late afternoon, we had a comprehensive settlement agreement ready for the judge's review. The major points were straightforward. I retained full ownership of all my business interests, including Caldwell and Associates. Our marital assets, the house, joint investment accounts, art collection, and Richard's retirement funds accumulated during our marriage, would be divided equally. We would sell the house and split the proceeds. No alimony for either party, given our respective financial situations. It was remarkably civil, especially considering how the day had begun. As we waited for Judge Harwood to review the agreement, I stepped out to call Diane. "So it's done?" she asked when I explained where we stood. "Almost," I replied, finding a quiet bench in the courthouse corridor. "The judge is reviewing the settlement agreement now." "And Richard?" Diane pressed. "How did he take the big revelation?" I smiled, remembering his face when the ownership documents were presented. "About as well as you'd expect. Initial shock, then damage control. He's actually been surprisingly reasonable since then." "Reasonable?" Diane sounded skeptical. "The Richard Matthews I know doesn't do reasonable unless there's something in it for him." "Well, there is," I acknowledged. "I'm not interfering with his position at the firm. That was his primary concern once the initial shock wore off." "Of course it was," Diane scoffed. "His career always came first." "It did," I agreed, feeling a twinge of something, not quite sadness, maybe nostalgia for what might have been. "But in fairness, so did mine. Just not in the way he assumed." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay, Liz? Really okay?" The question caught me off guard. Throughout this process, discovering the affair, receiving the divorce papers, planning my courtroom revelation, I'd been so focused on maintaining control that I hadn't really considered my emotional state. "I think I am," I said finally. "Not the way I expected to be, but yes. There's something freeing about all of this being in the open. No more secrets, no more pretending to be someone I'm not." "And what about Ashley?" Diane asked. "The girlfriend? Did she make an appearance?" "She did, actually." "Richard brought her to the courthouse this morning," I said, recalling the young woman's confused, then horrified expression as the ownership revelation unfolded. "We had a surprisingly civil conversation during the recess." "You spoke to her?" Diane sounded incredulous. "What did you say?" "Just the truth," I replied. "That Richard has a pattern, that she should watch how he treats her now that the power dynamic has shifted." I paused. She seemed genuinely blindsided by everything. Richard had fed her the same lines he feeds everyone, that I was cold, career-obsessed, neglectful. The irony being that you actually were career-focused, just not in the way he thought, Diane noted with a touch of amusement. "Exactly," I agreed. "Though I think the bigger irony is that if he'd bothered to actually get to know his wife, he might have found we had more in common than he realized." The bailiff appeared, signaling that Judge Harwood was ready for us. I quickly said goodbye to Diane and headed back to the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was markedly different from the morning's tension. Judge Harwood reviewed the final settlement agreement, noting her approval of the equitable terms. When she asked if either of us had any final comments before she signed off on the agreement, Richard and I both shook our heads. "Very well," the judge said, signing the documents with a flourish. "The terms of this settlement agreement are hereby incorporated into your divorce decree. Upon filing these documents with the clerk, your marriage will be legally dissolved." She looked between us. "I commend both parties for reaching an amicable resolution to what could have been a contentious matter." And just like that, 12 years of marriage ended with the stroke of a pen. No dramatic pronouncements, no last-minute objections, just the quiet finality of signatures on legal documents. As we gathered our belongings, Marcus approached me, extending his hand. "Elizabeth, I look forward to our continued professional relationship. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting next week to discuss the firm's quarterly projections?" It was a clear olive branch, an acknowledgement of my position and an attempt to establish a new purely professional connection. I accepted his handshake with a nod. "That would be fine, Marcus. Have your assistant contact mine to set it up." Richard stood nearby, watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. When Marcus stepped away to speak with the clerk, Richard approached me one last time. "So," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "It seems I've been working for my wife all these years without knowing it." "Ex-wife," I corrected gently. A flicker of something, regret, resignation, crossed his face. "Ex-wife," he acknowledged, "though still my boss, apparently." "Technically, I'm more of a major stakeholder than a boss," I clarified. "Though I suppose the distinction might feel academic from your perspective." Richard shook his head, a rueful smile playing at his lips. "You know, all those years I thought I was the clever one in our marriage." "You were clever," I assured him, "just not as observant as you should have been." He nodded, accepting this assessment. "What will you do now, with everyone knowing about your business interests, I mean?" It was a good question, one I'd been considering throughout the day. For years, I'd maintained separation between my personal and professional lives, between Elizabeth Matthews and Elizabeth Winters. That boundary had now been irrevocably breached. "I'm not entirely sure," I admitted, "but I think it's time I stopped hiding who I am and what I've built." Richard studied me for a moment, then offered his hand. "Good luck, Elizabeth." "I mean that." I took his hand, completing this final formal goodbye. "You too, Richard." As he walked away, I felt an unexpected lightness, as if I'd set down a burden I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. 12 years of pretending to be less than I was, of keeping my successes hidden, of living a compartmentalized life. All of that was over now. Whatever came next would be on my terms, my name, my truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke in my hotel suite feeling strangely calm. I'd decided not to return to our, now my, house immediately, preferring the neutral territory of the Four Seasons while I processed everything that had happened. The presidential suite's panoramic windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, the early morning light casting long shadows across the urban landscape. I sipped my coffee by the window, mentally preparing for the day ahead. With the divorce settled, it was time to address the professional implications of my revealed identity. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since yesterday afternoon, calls and messages from business associates, board members, and financial publications, who'd somehow gotten wind of the courtroom revelation. The story was spreading quickly through business circles. Elizabeth Winters, the reclusive investor known for her shrewd acquisitions and hands-off management style, was actually Elizabeth Matthews, soon-to-be ex-wife of prominent divorce attorney Richard Matthews. And more interestingly, she owned the very law firm where her husband had built his career. It had all the elements of a juicy corporate scandal, though the reality was far less dramatic than the speculation. Still, I knew I needed to take control of the narrative before rumors overshadowed facts. My first call was to James Sullivan, my longtime financial advisor, and one of the few people who knew both sides of my life. "The financial press is having a field day," he said after we exchanged greetings. "The Wall Street Journal wants a comment. So does Bloomberg." "No interviews," I replied firmly. "But I think it's time for a press release. Something simple that acknowledges my ownership position but emphasizes the continuity of operations at Caldwell and Associates. Good idea, James agreed. What about your other holdings? The real estate portfolio? The tech investments? Now that the connection between Elizabeth Matthews and Elizabeth Winters is public, people are digging into everything. I'd anticipated this. For years, I'd maintained separate identities not out of deception, but for privacy and practical business reasons. Elizabeth Winters was a name on legal documents, board minutes, and investment portfolios. Elizabeth Matthews was a name on social invitations, charity committees, and my marriage certificate. The intersection of those worlds would require careful navigation. I'll need a comprehensive communication strategy, I decided. Something that frames this as a simple matter of privacy preference rather than deliberate deception. I've already reached out to Clara at Apex PR, James said. She's prepared to help craft that narrative whenever you're ready. Clara Mason was the best crisis management specialist in the business. Though I didn't consider my situation a crisis, her expertise in shaping public perception would be invaluable. Set up a meeting for this afternoon, I instructed. And please contact the board members of all major holdings. I want to personally assure them that nothing has changed regarding my investment approach or management philosophy. After hanging up with James, I called Meredith to thank her for her exceptional handling of the divorce proceedings. It was my pleasure, she said warmly. Though I must admit, watching Richard's face when those ownership documents came out was a career highlight. I laughed, remembering his stunned expression. It was rather satisfying. Have you seen this morning's legal blog updates? Meredith asked. Your revelation is the talk of the legal community. Wife owns husband's law firm is trending on several platforms. Wonderful, I sighed. Just what I needed. If it helps, most of the commentary is actually positive, Meredith assured me. You're being portrayed as a savvy businesswoman who maintained professional boundaries despite personal connections. The fact that you didn't interfere with firm, operations, or Richard's career advancement speaks well of your ethics. That was something, at least. I'd never wanted my business dealings to become gossip fodder, but if it had to happen, a narrative of ethical management was preferable to alternatives. My next call was to Marcus, who sounded uncharacteristically anxious. Elizabeth, I've been fielding calls from every partner in the firm since yesterday afternoon, he began without preamble. They're concerned about potential changes in leadership or direction. I already told you nothing would change regarding firm operations, I reminded him. Was I unclear? No, but, he hesitated. Perhaps it would be helpful if you could address the partnership directly? A short meeting to reassure everyone that their positions are secure would go a long way toward calming nerves. I hadn't anticipated this level of anxiety from the partners. In hindsight, I should have. Lawyers, for all their outward confidence, could be remarkably insecure about their professional standing. I'll make time tomorrow, I agreed. But Marcus, I need you to understand something clearly. My ownership has been in place for 9 years, during which the firm has thrived. Nothing about yesterday's revelation changes the fundamental business relationship. I remain a passive owner, not an operational manager. I understand that, Marcus said carefully. But perception matters in our industry. The partners need to hear it directly from you. After a few more minutes discussing logistics for the meeting, we ended the call. I immediately reached for my notebook, jotting down key points I wanted to address with the partnership. This would be the first time I stepped into Caldwell and Associates as Elizabeth Winters, rather than Richard Matthews's wife. The impression I made would set the tone for all future interactions. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Lunch today? I want all the details from yesterday. I smiled, grateful for her unwavering friendship throughout this ordeal. Can't today. Meeting with PR team. Tomorrow? Her response came quickly. Tomorrow works. Your place or mine? I paused, considering. I hadn't been back to the house since the divorce was finalized. It was time. My place, I texted back. I need to start thinking of it that way again. As I prepared for my day, selecting a charcoal gray Armani suit and simple pearl earrings, I found myself reflecting on Richard's parting words. "What will you do now?" he had asked. The question seemed straightforward on the surface, but contained layers of complexity beneath. What would I do now? For so long, I'd compartmentalized my life. Elizabeth Matthews in one box, Elizabeth Winters in another, never allowing them to fully integrate. That separation had served its purpose, but it had also prevented me from fully embracing either identity. Perhaps the real opportunity in all of this wasn't just about maintaining my business, interests, or securing a fair divorce settlement. Perhaps it was about finally reconciling the different aspects of myself. The shrewd investor and the woman who had, despite everything, loved her husband enough to protect his ego at the expense of her own recognition. As I gathered my belongings and prepared to meet the day, I felt a new sense of purpose. The divorce wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. A chance to redefine myself on my own terms, without shadows or compartments or carefully maintained facades. For the first time in 12 years, I was simply Elizabeth. No divided loyalties, no hidden achievements, no separate identities. Just me, stepping fully into the light of my own creation. The Caldwell and Associates conference room fell silent as I stepped through the door. 14 partners, 13 men and 1 woman, sat around the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned to openly hostile. Marcus stood at the head of the table mid-sentence, clearly surprised by my punctual arrival. "Elizabeth," he recovered quickly, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. "Thank you for joining us. I was just briefing the partners on yesterday's developments." I nodded, choosing not to take the offered seat. Instead, I remained standing, surveying the room. Most of these attorneys I knew socially. They'd attended dinner parties at my home, brought their spouses to firm events, made small talk about vacations and children while carefully avoiding any substantive discussion of business with the managing partner's wife. Only now, they were seeing me through an entirely different lens. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady and confident. "I appreciate you all making time for this meeting. I understand yesterday's revelation has raised questions and concerns, which I'm here to address directly." A murmur rippled through the room. David Chen, head of the corporate division, and one of Richard's closest allies at the firm, leaned forward. "With all due respect, Mrs. Matthews, Ms. Winters in this context," I corrected him gently. "Though I used my married name socially, all my business dealings have been conducted under my maiden name." David looked momentarily flustered but pressed on. "Ms. Winters, then. The partnership is concerned about potential conflicts of interest. Your ownership position, combined with your personal relationship with Richard, creates a complex situation that could affect firm governance." "My divorce from Richard was finalized yesterday," I replied calmly. "As for my ownership position, it's been in place for 9 years without interference in firm operations. Why would that change now?" "Because now we know about it," Patricia Reynolds, the firm's only female partner, stated bluntly. Unlike her colleagues, she didn't look hostile. If anything, she seemed intrigued. 9 years of undisclosed ownership raises questions about transparency and intent. I nodded, acknowledging her point. "I understand your concern. However, my ownership was never undisclosed in a legal sense. The proper corporate documentation was filed with all relevant authorities. The board of the parent company was fully informed. The fact that I chose not to advertise my position to the operational teams was a personal decision, not a deceptive one." "A personal decision influenced by your marriage to Richard?" Patricia pressed. "Initially, yes," I admitted. "When I first acquired controlling interest, Richard was an associate on track for partnership. I didn't want his advancement to be tainted by the perception of favoritism or nepotism." "And later?" Marcus asked quietly. I met his gaze steadily. Later, it simply became the established arrangement. The firm was thriving under your leadership. There was no business reason to change the status quo. Jonathan Graves, the oldest partner and one of the firm's founders, spoke up. What are your intentions now, Ms. Winters? Will you be taking a more active role in management decisions? No, I stated firmly. My investment approach has always been to acquire well-run businesses and allow competent management teams to continue operating them. Caldwell & Associates has consistently been one of my most successful investments, precisely because of the leadership in this room. The tension in the room visibly decreased, shoulders relaxing as partners exchanged glances. That said, I continued, I do believe we need to formalize certain aspects of our relationship moving forward. The informal firewall that existed while I was married to Richard needs to be replaced with proper corporate governance structures, now that my ownership is widely known. Marcus nodded. What do you propose? First, a clear reporting structure between the partnership and the holding company board, with appropriate information sharing but maintained operational independence, I said, outlining the plan I'd developed. Second, a review of any cases where my other business interests might create potential conflicts. And third, Richard's role within the firm needs to be carefully defined to avoid any appearance of impropriety, given our former relationship. At the mention of Richard, several partners shifted uncomfortably. David Chen cleared his throat. Richard is one of our top billers. His divorce practice brings in substantial revenue. I'm aware of his value to the firm, I assured them. I have no intention of interfering with his position here. This is a professional matter, not a personal vendetta. Patricia studied me with open curiosity. You're remarkably pragmatic about working with your ex-husband, I smiled slightly. Business is business. Personal feelings have no place in investment decisions. Speaking of Richard, Marcus interjected, he's requested a brief leave of absence. Given the circumstances, I approved it this morning. This was news to me, but I kept my expression neutral. That seems reasonable. A cooling-off period might be beneficial for everyone. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, with partners, asking increasingly technical questions about corporate structure, voting rights, and investment strategy. I answered each query directly, emphasizing continuity, while acknowledging the need for updated governance. By the time we concluded, the atmosphere had shifted from suspicious tension to cautious acceptance. As the partners filed out, several nodded respectfully in my direction. Patricia Reynolds lingered, approaching me after the others had left. That was impressive, she said without preamble. You handled a room full of territorial lawyers better than most federal judges. Thank you, I replied, gathering my notes. Though I suspect winning them over completely will take more than one good meeting. Patricia laughed, particularly the old guard. They're still adjusting to having one female partner. Now they discover a woman owns the entire firm. She shook her head. Some of their expressions were priceless. I smiled, appreciating her candor. Change can be difficult, especially when it challenges long-held assumptions. Indeed, she agreed. By the way, Richard never mentioned you had a business background. He always described you as the supportive wife, I supplied when she hesitated. The social coordinator? The charity committee member? Something like that, Patricia acknowledged with a wry smile. Although I always thought there must be more to you. No one hosts a dinner party with that level of strategic seating arrangement without having a tactical mind. I laughed, surprised by her observation. You noticed that? I notice everything, she said simply. It's why I made partner despite the odds. She extended her hand. I look forward to working with you in your new, more visible capacity, Ms. Winters. As I shook her hand, I felt an unexpected sense of kinship. Please, call me Elizabeth. After Patricia left, Marcus returned to the conference room, appearing more relaxed than he had all morning. That went better than expected, he admitted. You have a natural authority that caught some of them off guard. Being underestimated has its advantages, I replied, gathering my belongings. People reveal more when they don't view you as a threat. Marcus studied me with newfound respect. You know, in all the years you attended firm events as Richard's wife, I never once suspected you were analyzing our business operations. I wasn't, not specifically, I clarified. My interest has always been in the firm's overall performance, not day-to-day management decisions. That remains true going forward. He nodded, seemingly reassured. Richard's leave of absence. I hope that wasn't a surprise. It was, I acknowledged, but a sensible one. Where did he go? He didn't say, Marcus replied. Just that he needed some time to recalibrate, as he put it. Recalibrate. That sounded like Richard, always framing personal setbacks in professional terms. I wondered if Ashley had gone with him but didn't ask. That part of his life was no longer my concern. As I walked through the firm's elegant lobby, passing the brass plaque listing partner names including Richard J. Matthews, I felt strangely at peace. This firm, which had for years been the center of Richard's identity and a peripheral part of mine, now represented something different. A successful investment, yes, but also a symbol of my emergence from the shadows. Outside, my driver was waiting with the car. As we pulled away from the curb, I glanced back at the imposing glass tower housing Caldwell & Associates. For 12 years, I had entered that building as Richard's wife. Today, I had entered it as Elizabeth Winters, majority owner. The difference was subtle but profound, like stepping from a supporting role into the spotlight of my own story. 3 weeks after the divorce hearing, I finally finished moving Richard's remaining possessions into storage. Our house, my house now, felt different without his presence. Larger, quieter, more authentically mine. I'd spent the weekend rearranging furniture, removing family photos that no longer reflected reality, and replacing them with art I'd always loved but Richard had deemed too abstract for the main living areas. The transformation wasn't just physical. With each change, I reclaimed a little more of myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Reynolds. Lunch tomorrow? I have news about the Harrington account. In the weeks since our first meeting, Patricia and I had developed an unexpected professional rapport. While I maintained my commitment to non-interference in firm operations, she occasionally sought my perspective on strategic matters, less as the owner and more as a fellow businesswoman with complementary expertise. 12:30 at Lucien's, I suggested. The upscale bistro was discreet enough for business conversations while being far enough from the firm to avoid office politics. Perfect, she replied. Also, rumor has it Richard returns tomorrow. I stared at the message, absorbing its implications. 3 weeks of silence from Richard. No calls, no emails, not even a message through attorneys about remaining personal items. Just a complete communications blackout, while he recalibrated. Now, apparently, he was ready to return. Thanks for the heads up, I texted back, keeping my response neutral. Part of me had wondered if Richard might simply resign rather than face the altered dynamics at the firm. But that wouldn't be his style. Richard Matthews didn't retreat from challenges. He reframed them as opportunities. I suspected he'd spent his absence crafting a narrative that minimized his humiliation and maximized his resilience. The next morning, I met with Clara Mason from Apex PR to review the press strategy we'd implemented since the divorce. The initial wave of business media interest had been managed through a carefully worded press release confirming my ownership stake in various enterprises, while emphasizing the unchanged operational management. Follow-up questions had been addressed selectively, with Clara steering the narrative toward my business acumen rather than the personal drama of the divorce. The story's losing momentum, Clara reported, showing me the media tracking metrics. Financial outlets have moved on to newer scandals, and legal blogs are focusing more on your investment strategy than your marriage. Good, I said, relieved. The less drama, the better. There is one pending request you might want to consider, Clara added, sliding a folder across the table. Williams Business Quarterly wants to feature you in their Hidden Forces series on influential behind-the-scenes investors. I raised an eyebrow. That's a prestigious profile. It is, Clara agreed, and strategically timed. This would shift the narrative from wife who secretly owned husband's firm to successful investor with diversified portfolio. The divorce would be a footnote rather than the headline. I considered the opportunity. For years, I'd avoided public attention around my business activities, preferring to operate without scrutiny or expectation. But circumstances had changed. My dual identities had merged, for better or worse. Perhaps it was time to embrace a more integrated public persona. Set it up, I decided. But review the questions beforehand, and I want approval on the final copy. After finishing with Clara, I headed to Lucian's for my lunch with Patricia. She was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, a manila folder beside her water glass. The prodigal partner returns, she said by way of greeting. Richard's back, complete with a tan and a new Rolex. I settled into my chair, signaling the waiter for a sparkling water. How dramatic was the entrance? Patricia smiled wryly. Measured. He came in early, before most people arrived. Closed-door meeting with Marcus first, then straight to his office. No grand announcements, no obvious displays of either contrition or defiance. Tactical, I noted. Let others make the first move, gauge the reception, then adjust accordingly. Exactly what I thought, Patricia agreed. Very Richard. The waiter arrived to take our orders. Once he departed, Patricia leaned forward slightly. There's something you should know, she said, her voice lower. Ashley resigned last week, took a paralegal position at Brenner and Walsh across town. I absorbed this information without visible reaction. Interesting timing, isn't it? Patricia raised an eyebrow. Particularly since Brenner and Walsh specializes in corporate law, not divorce cases like she was working on with Richard. The implications were clear. Either Ashley had chosen to make a clean break from Richard professionally as well as personally, or he had engineered her departure to simplify his return. Either way, their relationship apparently hadn't survived. The courtroom revelation. How are the other partners responding to Richard's return? I asked, steering the conversation to more relevant territory. Patricia shrugged. Cautiously. Most are taking cues from Marcus, who's treating it as business as usual. A few of the younger partners seem uncertain how to interact with him given his unique position. As the ex-husband of the firm's owner, I supplied. Precisely. She smiled. It's unprecedented territory for everyone. Our food arrived, and we shifted to discussing the Harrington account, a significant corporate client considering consolidating all their legal work with Caldwell and Associates. Patricia outlined the strategy she was developing to secure the expanded business, occasionally asking my opinion on negotiation approaches. As we finished our meal, Patricia hesitated before asking, "Have you spoken to Richard since the hearing?" "No," I replied simply. "Our communication goes through attorneys when necessary, which hasn't been often. The divorce settlement was comprehensive." She nodded, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "He's different since he came back. More focused, less performative." She met my gaze directly. "Whatever happened during your marriage and divorce, I think it may have actually improved him professionally. It was an unexpected observation, but not entirely surprising. Richard had always responded to challenges by doubling down on his professional identity. If he couldn't control the narrative around his marriage and divorce, he would excel even more dramatically in the arena he still dominated. People reveal their true character through how they handle setbacks," I said non-committally. After lunch, I had my driver take me to the office tower that housed several of my investment companies. Unlike Caldwell and Associates, where I remained primarily a passive investor, these businesses saw me more regularly in my capacity as Elizabeth Winters. My assistant greeted me with a stack of messages and meeting confirmations. The Williams. Business Quarterly Reporter is scheduled for next Wednesday at 10 a.m., she informed me. And Mr. Sullivan called twice about the technology acquisition. I nodded, scanning the messages. Anything else urgent? She hesitated. There was one caller who wouldn't leave a message. He just said you'd know what it was regarding. She glanced at her notes. A Mr. Matthews. I kept my expression neutral despite my surprise. When did he call? About an hour ago. He said he'd try again later. I thanked her and continued to my office, wondering what could possibly prompt Richard to call me directly after 3 weeks of silence. Our divorce was final, our assets divided, our legal and financial ties nearly completely severed. What could he want now? The answer came sooner than expected. I had barely settled at my desk when my office phone rang. My assistant's voice came through the speaker. Ms. Winters, Richard Matthews is on line 1. Should I tell him you're unavailable? I hesitated only briefly. No, I'll take it. Whatever Richard wanted, I preferred to address it directly rather than postpone the inevitable. I picked up the receiver. This is Elizabeth. Elizabeth. Richard's voice was exactly as I remembered it. Confident, measured, with that slight, authoritative edge he used in professional settings. Thank you for taking my call. I wasn't sure you would. What can I do for you, Richard? I asked, keeping my tone businesslike. He cleared his throat. I'd like to meet, in person. There are some matters we should discuss face to face. What matters? I asked. The divorce is finalized. Your possessions have been moved to storage. The house is going on the market next week. This isn't about the divorce or our personal property, he said. It's about the firm, about moving forward professionally in a way that works for both of us. I considered his request. Meeting in person carried potential complications, but refusing might appear petty or vindictive. Impressions I'd carefully avoided throughout our divorce proceedings. When and where? I asked finally. Tomorrow evening? He suggested. Neutral territory, the rooftop bar at the Archer Hotel. The choice was deliberate, I knew. The Archer was neither a place we had frequented together during our marriage, nor a location associated with either of our business venues. Truly neutral ground. 7 o'clock, I agreed. I can give you 30 minutes. Thank you, he said, his relief evident even through the professional veneer. I appreciate your willingness to meet. After hanging up, I sat motionless for several moments, processing this unexpected development. What could Richard possibly want to discuss about the firm that couldn't be handled through normal corporate channels? And why now, after 3 weeks of silence? I had successfully navigated the immediate aftermath of our divorce, established clear boundaries with the firm's partnership, and begun reshaping my public identity on my terms. Now Richard was re-entering the picture, potentially disrupting the careful balance I'd established. Whatever he wanted, I needed to be prepared. Richard Matthews never entered a negotiation without a strategy. I would need to do the same. The Archer Hotel's rooftop bar offered a stunning panoramic view of the city skyline, the early evening light casting a golden glow over glass and steel towers. I arrived precisely at 7, dressed in a sleek navy dress that projected confidence without being overtly formal. The maitre d' guided me to a secluded corner table where Richard was already waiting. He stood as I approached, his appearance both familiar and somehow different. The tan Patricia had mentioned suited him, but there was something else, a subtle shift in his demeanor, less performative swagger and more genuine presence. Elizabeth, he greeted me, waiting for me to sit before returning to his chair. Thank you for coming. You indicated it was important, I replied, setting my purse aside and declining the menu the server offered. Just sparkling water with lime, I told him before turning back to Richard. You're looking well. 3 weeks on a sailboat in the Yada Azar. Caribbean will do that, he said with a slight smile. It was clarifying. Is that where you went? I asked, genuinely curious. Richard had never shown particular interest in sailing during our marriage. He nodded. A college friend's boat. I needed space to think without the constant scrutiny of colleagues or the legal community. The server returned with my water and Richard's scotch. After he departed, I leaned forward slightly. So, what is it you wanted to discuss about the firm? Richard took a measured sip of his drink before responding. I've been offered a partnership position at Brenner & Walsh. This was unexpected. Brenner & Walsh was a rival firm, prestigious in its own right, though without the legacy status of Caldwell & Associates. Congratulations, I said carefully, though I'm surprised they'd poach from Caldwell so openly. They approached me during my leave of absence, Richard explained. Their divorce practice needs rebuilding, and they're willing to offer significant incentives. I studied him, trying to understand his angle. Why tell me this, Richard? Your career decisions are your own. We're divorced, and as I've made clear to everyone at Caldwell, I don't interfere with staffing matters. Because accepting would put us in direct competition, he said simply. And given our unique situation, I thought that warranted a conversation. I raised an eyebrow. You mean the fact that I own your current firm? That, and our history, he acknowledged. I wanted to ensure there wouldn't be any complications if I made this move. Complications, I repeated. Are you asking if I'd use my ownership position at Caldwell to retaliate against you or Brenner & Walsh in some way? Richard had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Not exactly. I know you well enough to know that's not how you operate. But business is business, and our situation is unprecedented. I took a sip of my water, considering his implied question. My investment in Caldwell & Associates has always been business-driven, not personal. That doesn't change because of our divorce or your potential career moves. Relief flickered across his face, quickly replaced by his typical composed expression. I appreciate that clarity. Though I am curious, I added, why you'd leave Caldwell? Now? You've spent 12 years building your reputation there. Starting over at Brenner would mean rebuilding a significant portion of your client base. Richard twirled his glass slowly, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Several reasons. The opportunity is substantial, financially. But more importantly, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. It would create a cleaner break, for both of us. I understood the subtext. Remaining at Caldwell meant navigating the complex dynamics of working at a firm owned by his ex-wife. Every success would be scrutinized, every failure magnified through that lens. Moving to Brenner offered a fresh start, professionally and personally. That's considerate, I acknowledged, though unnecessary from my perspective. Perhaps, he conceded. But the past 3 weeks gave me time to reflect on many things, including what kind of relationship we might have moving forward. I believe maintaining some professional distance would be beneficial. There was something different in his tone, a sincerity I hadn't heard from Richard in years. The revelation in the courtroom and its aftermath seemed to have stripped away some of his carefully constructed facade. If that's what you want, I support your decision, I said simply. He nodded, appearing genuinely grateful for my understanding. There's something else I wanted to discuss. Yes? I owe you an apology, he said, meeting my gaze directly. A real one, not the political version I offered in court. I remained silent, waiting. For years, I thought I knew you, he continued. Or rather, I thought I knew all there was to know about you. I never bothered to look deeper, to ask questions, to really see who you were beyond the role I'd assigned you in my life. The admission was unexpected, all the more powerful for being evidently unrehearsed. That was my failure, he acknowledged. And it cost me more than I realized until recently. I considered his words carefully, aware that my response would define whatever relationship, or lack thereof, we might have moving forward. Thank you for saying that, I said finally. We both contributed to the distance that grew between us. I kept parts of myself separate, created boundaries you didn't even know existed. Why did you? He asked, genuine curiosity in his expression. Maintain that separation so completely, I mean. It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since our confrontation in court. Initially, it was to protect your pride, I admitted. Later, it became habit, and eventually, I paused, searching for the right words. Eventually, it became a test. I wondered if you would ever care enough to really see me, to ask the right questions, to look beyond the surface. Understanding dawned in his eyes. A test I failed spectacularly. We both did, I acknowledged. Failed to communicate, failed to grow together rather than apart. We sat in silence for a moment, the admission hanging between us, not healing the past exactly, but allowing us to see it more clearly. For what it's worth, Richard said eventually, I'm sorry about Ashley. Bringing her to the courthouse was petty and unprofessional. It was, I agreed, but in a strange way I should thank you for it. If you hadn't been so determined to make a statement that day, I might have continued letting you underestimate me indefinitely. He laughed softly, shaking his head. The great Richard Matthews, outmaneuvered by the wife he never truly knew. Ex-wife, I corrected gently, echoing our exchange from the courthouse. Ex-wife, he acknowledged with a slight smile. Though still a formidable opponent, it seems. As the city lights began to illuminate the darkening sky, I realized our conversation had extended well beyond the 30 minutes I'd allocated. Surprisingly, I didn't mind. This exchange, honest, unguarded, without the emotional charge of our marriage or divorce proceedings, felt like proper closure. I should go, I said, gathering my purse. But I wish you well at Brenner and Walsh, if that's what you decide. Richard nodded, standing as I did. And I wish you success with your profile in Williams Business Quarterly. Marcus mentioned it. Thanks, he? You? I replied, slightly surprised he'd brought it up. As we prepared to part ways, Richard hesitated, then extended his hand. To new beginnings? I accepted the handshake, the gesture formal, yet somehow appropriate for this moment of transition. To new beginnings. Walking away from the rooftop bar, I felt lighter somehow, as if the final threads binding me to my old life had been gently untangled rather than abruptly severed. Richard and I would never be friends, exactly, but perhaps we could be something more valuable. Former adversaries who had reached a place of mutual respect. The elevator doors opened onto the hotel lobby, and as I stepped out, I realized I was genuinely looking forward to tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, in a way I hadn't in years. 1 year later, I stood in my office at Winters Investment Group, reviewing the final proofs for our annual report. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city, including, if I looked at just the right angle, the building, housing Caldwell and Associates. So much had changed in 12 months. After years of operating behind layers of holding companies and investment vehicles, I had consolidated my business interests under a single, transparent corporate structure. Winters Investment Group now publicly managed my portfolio, including my continued majority stake in Caldwell and Associates. The Williams Business Quarterly profile had been a turning point, transforming me from a curiosity, the wife who secretly owned her husband's law firm, into a respected investment strategist with a track record of identifying undervalued assets across multiple industries. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, now the managing partner at Caldwell and Associates after Marcus's retirement 3 months ago. Quarterly numbers look excellent. Partnership vote approved the expansion proposal unanimously. Dinner next week to celebrate? I smiled, texting back my agreement. Patricia's elevation to managing partner had been my only significant influence on the firm's operations in the past year. When Marcus announced his retirement, I had quietly suggested to the board that they consider Patricia, not because she was a woman, but because she was unquestionably the most strategic thinker among the partners. The board had agreed, and the firm was thriving under her leadership. My assistant knocked on the door frame. "Ms. Winters, the Thompson Group representatives are here for your meeting." "Thank you, Sarah. Please show them in." As I gathered my presentation materials, I caught sight of the framed magazine cover on my wall. The Williams Business Quarterly issue featuring me as one of their hidden forces in investment. The headline read, "Elizabeth Winters, the strategist who built an empire in plain sight." The photo shoot had been a novel experience. After years of being photographed primarily as Richard's wife at social events, posing as a businesswoman in my own right had felt simultaneously foreign and empowering. The photographer had captured something in my expression. Confidence, certainly, but also a quiet satisfaction that came from finally integrating all aspects of my identity. The meeting with the Thompson Group went smoothly. Another potential acquisition for my growing portfolio. As the executives filed out, Sarah appeared with a reminder about my afternoon appointments. "The real estate closing at 2, and then you're meeting Diane for coffee at 4, she recited. "Also, this arrived. For you?" She handed me a thick cream envelope with elegant calligraphy on the front. I recognized the style immediately. Richard's favorite stationery shop had a distinctive way of addressing envelopes. Opening it, I found a formal invitation to the opening of Brenner, Walsh, and Matthews' new office space, along with a handwritten note. "Elizabeth, I hope this finds you well. Our firm's expansion represents a significant milestone, and despite our history, I would consider it an honor if you would attend the opening reception. Professional courtesy aside, I believe it would demonstrate to our colleagues that successful people can navigate complex personal histories with grace. Respectfully, Richard P.S. You'll be pleased to know I've taken your inadvertent lesson about due diligence to heart. I've acquired a minority partnership stake in Brenner and Walsh, rather than simply accepting a salaried position. Never again will I be unaware of who truly owns my firm." I smiled at the postscript, so characteristic of Richard, acknowledging the lesson while simultaneously demonstrating he'd evolved beyond it. His move to Brenner and Walsh had indeed been the clean break he'd anticipated. In the past year, he'd rebuilt his practice, re-established his reputation, and apparently secured an ownership position in his new professional home. We had encountered each other occasionally at industry events, maintaining polite, distant cordiality. Our divorce had become old news, replaced by fresher scandals and more interesting business developments. The awkwardness had gradually faded, leaving behind something that wasn't quite friendship, but was far from animosity. 1 year later, I stood in my office at Winters Investment Group, reviewing the final proofs for our annual report. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city, including, if I looked at just the right angle, the building, housing Caldwell and Associates. So much had changed in 12 months. After years of operating behind layers of holding companies and investment vehicles, I had consolidated my business interests under a single, transparent corporate structure. Winters Investment Group now publicly managed my portfolio, including my continued majority stake in Caldwell and Associates. The Williams Business Quarterly profile had been a turning point, transforming me from a curiosity, the wife who secretly owned her husband's law firm, into a respected investment strategist with a track record of identifying undervalued assets across multiple industries. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, now the managing partner at Caldwell and Associates after Marcus's retirement 3 months ago. "Quarterly numbers look excellent. Partnership vote approved the expansion proposal unanimously. Dinner next week to celebrate?" I smiled, texting back my agreement. Patricia's elevation to managing partner had been my only significant influence on the firm's operations in the past year. When Marcus announced his retirement, I had quietly suggested to the board that they consider Patricia, not because she was a woman, but because she was unquestionably the most strategic thinker among the partners. The board had agreed, and the firm was thriving under her leadership. My assistant knocked on the door frame. "Ms. Winters, the Thompson Group representatives are here for your meeting." "Thank you, Sarah. Please show them in." As I gathered my presentation materials, I caught sight of the framed magazine cover on my wall, the Williams Business Quarterly issue featuring me as one of their hidden forces in investment. The headline read, "Elizabeth Winters, the strategist who built an empire in plain sight." The photo shoot had been a novel experience. After years of being photographed primarily as Richard's wife at social events, posing as a businesswoman in need, my own right had felt simultaneously foreign and empowering. The photographer had captured something in my expression. Confidence, certainly, but also a quiet satisfaction that came from finally integrating all aspects of my identity. The meeting with the Thompson Group went smoothly. Another potential acquisition for my growing portfolio. As the executives filed out, Sarah appeared with a reminder about my afternoon appointments. "The real estate closing at 2, and then you're meeting Diane for coffee at 4, she recited. "Also, this arrived. For you?" She handed me a thick cream envelope with elegant calligraphy on the front. I recognized the style immediately. Richard's favorite stationery shop had a distinctive way of addressing envelopes. Opening it, I found a formal invitation to the opening of Brenner, Walsh, and Matthews' new office space, along with a handwritten note. "Elizabeth, I hope this finds you well. Our firm's expansion represents a significant milestone, and despite our history, I would consider it an honor if you would attend the opening reception. Professional courtesy aside, I believe it would demonstrate to our colleagues that successful people can navigate complex personal histories with grace. Respectfully, Richard P.S. You'll be pleased to know I've taken your inadvertent lesson about due diligence to heart. I've acquired a minority partnership stake in Brenner and Walsh, rather than simply accepting a salaried position. Never again will I be unaware of who truly owns my firm." I smiled at the postscript, so characteristic of Richard, acknowledging the lesson while simultaneously demonstrating he'd evolved beyond it. His move to Brenner and Walsh had indeed been the clean break he'd anticipated. In the past year, he'd rebuilt his practice, re-established his reputation, and apparently secured an ownership position in his new professional home. We had encountered each other occasionally at industry events, maintaining polite, distant cordiality. Our divorce had become old news, replaced by fresher scandals and more interesting business developments. The awkwardness had gradually faded, leaving behind something that wasn't quite friendship, but was far from animosity. I placed the invitation on my desk, making a mental note to send a polite acceptance. Richard's gesture, while partly political, also represented something important: acknowledgement that our shared history, complex as it was, needn't define our futures. My phone rang, Diane calling about our coffee meeting. After confirming the time, she asked, "How's the new place coming along?" "Almost finished," I replied, smiling at the thought of my new home. 6 months after the divorce, I'd sold our marital house and purchased a penthouse overlooking the river. The space was entirely mine, designed to my taste without compromise or consideration for anyone else's preferences. "I can't wait to see it," Diane said enthusiastically, "especially that library you've been talking about." "It's my favorite room," I admitted. After years of Richard insisting that bookshelves detracted from the clean aesthetic he preferred, I'd created a library that indulged my love of literature completely. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a rolling ladder, comfortable reading chairs, and windows that filled the space with natural light. "You sound happy, Liz," Diane observed. "Really happy." "I am," I realized, somewhat surprised by how true the statement felt. The past year had brought challenges, certainly, reconstructing my professional identity, establishing new personal boundaries, learning to live alone after 12 years of marriage. But with those challenges had come a profound sense of authenticity and self-determination. After we hung up, I walked to the windows, gazing out at the city spread before me. From this height, I could see the river winding through downtown, the park where Richard had proposed, the courthouse where our marriage had ended, and the office buildings where our separate careers continued to flourish. It was strange how a city could contain so many chapters of one's life, each building and street corner holding memories that evolved in meaning over time. The restaurant where we'd celebrated our anniversary now hosted business dinners with potential investors. The courthouse that had witnessed our divorce now saw me occasionally consulting on business litigation matters. Places remained the same. It was people who changed, who grew, who reinterpreted their experiences through the lens of new understanding. My reflection in the window caught my attention. Confident posture, direct gaze, no hint of the carefully constructed supportive wife I'd portrayed for so many years. Just Elizabeth Winters, exactly as she was, without pretense or compartmentalization. The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Winters, your car is ready whenever you are." "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be down in 5 minutes." I gathered my belongings, including the invitation from Richard. Life had a peculiar symmetry sometimes. A year ago, I had sat in a courthouse, revealing my ownership of Caldwell and Associates as Richard and his girlfriend watched in shock. The moment had been both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of a marriage built on partial truths and the commencement of a life lived in full authenticity. Now Richard was inviting me to witness the fruits of his fresh start, extending a professional courtesy that acknowledged our shared history while respecting our separate paths forward. I would attend, of course, not out of any lingering attachment or desire for reconciliation, but because it represented how far we had both come, from adversaries in a contentious divorce to professionals who could acknowledge each other's success without rancor. As I stepped into the elevator, I reflected on the strange, unexpected journey of the past year. The revelation that was meant to humble Richard had ultimately liberated us both, him from the confines of a marriage where he never truly saw his wife, and me from the self-imposed restrictions of a divided identity. The doors opened onto the lobby, and I walked confidently toward the waiting car, no longer Elizabeth Matthews, supportive wife and secret investor, nor Elizabeth Winters, reclusive businesswoman operating in the shadows, just Elizabeth, whole, undivided, and finally, completely herself.